All right, I think we are live. Okay. All right. Hi, everyone. Hope you can all see me and hear me. Welcome. Happy Sunday. Hope you are all happy, safe, and healthy wherever you are in the world today. And I want to thank you all once again for joining me in this week's session of live Sacred Space. As always, I'm honored to be with you here in this time of sensitivity and uncertainty. And I look forward to sharing time with you in our shared sacred space together today. So the things we'll do here today in our sacred space, as usual, we'll just follow our regular format this week. We'll go ahead and set sacred space, and then we'll have a talk about an overall topic for the week. And the topic for this week will be the power of grief in transformation. The power of grief in transformation. And then we'll have a bit of an exercise kind of associated with that topic, and then we'll close our sacred space. So in setting sacred space, I'll start by saying that what we would like to do here, let me just make sure the feed is actually working. Okay. So what we would like to do here is to create a space together which is devoid of fear, threat, and control, in order for us to open to higher guidance from within our own selves, not from the outside, but from within our own selves, however we choose to define that. It could be flashes of brilliant insight. It could be our intuition. It could be guidance from a higher being, like a muse or something. Whatever lens or pattern or framework we use to think about that. Generally, we would like to have a safe sanctuary space for all of us to be able to relax and surrender and open to this guidance with no feeling of danger or threat, so that we can partake then of the nourishment, the emotional nourishment and the spiritual nourishment that comes from being in sacred space together as a group. And in opening sacred space today, I will propose, as I do every week, that we all follow the 4 principles of Presidian sacred space. Number 1 is confidentiality. So standard Vegas rules, what happens in sacred space stays in sacred space. Now that's the rule we follow when we're in person, when we're not in the middle of a pandemic, when we travel around and we meet advisees all over the world. Here online though, the stream is public, the replay will be public. So the way we handle confidentiality is via anonymization. So if you would like to be anonymous, you don't have to be anonymous. But if you would like to be, you would come into the Crowdcast stream, you would go into your edit profile function in Crowdcast, change your username to Mickey Mouse or Harry Potter, whatever you like, and then proceed to chat and ask questions under that username. And you don't have to participate if you don't want. You don't have to be anonymous if you don't want. But that's the first principle. The second principle is that we do our best to refrain from any kind of feeling of threat or controlling or even fixing, right? Intervening, so even control with a well-meaning intention. So there's no fixing, there's no interventions, there's no tough love, there's no curing of anything specific. We're here to hold space for each other, to be however we actually are. We're here to hold space for each other, to be afraid, to be anxious, to be happy and relaxed. And then also the level above that, which is how we feel about how we feel, right? So I'm afraid and I feel awful about being afraid. Or I'm afraid and I feel fine about being afraid. Or I'm happy and I feel okay that I'm happy. Or I feel happy and I feel very guilty and incompetent that how can I actually feel happy in this very difficult time? So however you feel and however you feel about how you feel, we leave you as you are, right? We hold space for you in whatever state you are. And there is a certain nourishment that comes just from that, right? The third principle is that as a corollary to the first two, which is that there is no commerce, right? So nothing may be sold in sacred space. I can't sell you anything. Gowrie, my editor in Bangalore, who will be on screen in a moment, cannot sell you anything. Please refrain from selling things to each other in the chat. And that includes recommendations or suggestions, right? So if you say, oh, I'm in a really tough way, and I don't know, I'm going through this thing in my life, we would refrain from even saying, oh yeah, try this program of mine. It works great. or try this book written by this person I don't even know. I'm not getting any compensation for pitching this book. But I read this book and it's great. You should try it. So we even refrain from that. Not because it's a bad thing, right? But because since it's a recommendation, it is a bit of an element of control and a bit of an element of threat, where now that I've recommended this thing, if you're like, well, if I don't read it or I don't at least look into the book, I feel this internal threat of like, well, then I may not get the solution to my big life problem that I just, shared on here in confidence, right? And because there's a bit of threat and control, that kicks us back into the realm of the profane, which is intrinsically the realm of fear, threat, and control. And the point to make here is not that the profane is bad, right? Just because we delineate sacred and profane and we want to spend an hour or two in the sacred, we're not saying profane is bad. Profane is just profane. But there are certain things you could only get done in the realm of the profane. Buying groceries, going to the bank, other things like that, right? And there are similarly things that you can only get done in the realm of the sacred. And so we seek to maintain that sacred space free of fear, threat, and control. Not because it's better or worse, but because there are certain things that you can only get done in the sacred. And we set aside an hour or two every week on Sundays to sit in the sacred so we can get our stuff done in sacred space, okay? So no commerce, no recommendations, nothing may be sold or recommended or suggested. We are here for your energy, not for the things you bring. We are here for what you are in your essence, not for what you do or provide. We are not here for your value add. We're here for you. And then the fourth principle, which is also a corollary, is that there is no expectation of participation. So there's no pressure to do anything. You can chat or not chat. You can ask questions or not ask questions. You can forward the link to your friends and bring them in, or you can not do that. None of that matters. There's no pressure to do anything. Again, the nourishment comes from the held space and your open, easy, willing presence and attention from moment to moment, from what you are, not from what you do or provide. And all of us together here then will tend to amplify that effect. Okay. So this is what I propose. And if you are not okay with it, that's totally all right. There is no fear, threat, or control to whip you into coming into sacred space or staying in sacred space. You come and go as you please. But we are about to cross the threshold into our sacred space. So we want to pause now to give everyone a moment to withdraw from the group if you would like, or stay in the group if you would like, however you like. And if you choose not to be in sacred space, that's totally okay. We'll still catch up with you later in profane space. We'll still hang out. We'll still be friends. No worries at all. But we want to give you a moment right now to pause and make your selection and dial that in. Okay. Okay. And now for the rest of us, we will now move forward together into our shared sacred space. And as we cross the threshold now into our shared sacred space, I'll just remind everyone that here we would like to observe the four principles of Presidian sacred space: confidentiality, anonymization, no fear, threat, or control, no fixing, no interventions, no commerce, no suggestions or recommendations, and no expectation of participation. All right. Welcome to Sacred Space, everyone. Happy Sunday. Hope you've had a good week. This is certainly one of the best parts of my week. And let's now move forward into our topic of the week. So our session topic for this week will be the power of grief in transformation. The power of grief in transformation. So in this week's brainstorm with myself and Gary, my editor in Bangalore, The story she chose and read to me kind of led us together into a return to the theme of traversing the different realms of life that we had covered 2 sessions ago. And from this, the profound intrinsic power of grief, the power of grief as a necessary element of making these traversals and transitions complete and generative and fruitful, right? And the idea is grief is not just this thing that hits us when a random sort of unfortunate event hits us in life. And I guess if we must, we will go into grief. But grief is a natural part of the cyclical rhythms of life as you cross the 3 realms of being. And to the extent that that natural inhale and exhale of life, that grief is included in, and to the extent that you push that out or try to excise and cut that out, you're unable to take a full breath in a lot of ways. You're unable to make the transitions fully complete, generative, and fruitful. Okay, so that's the topic for today. And what we'll do is we will share a folktale from the Malay tradition, the Malaysian tradition, and then let the golden thread kind of lead us forward from there. So Gary, if you're there, would love to invite you to come on screen. I think I can hear you. There you are.
Hi, Artie.
Hi, Gary.
Hi.
Happy Sunday. Thanks for being here again.
Hi, everyone. Yeah.
All right. So tell us about the story you selected.
Yeah, so it was kind of lovely because, just last week we were doing, we did the story, not last week, but the week before that. We did the story about, traversing the 3 realms. And I had this thought at the time about how this was kind of reminiscent of the Swan Maidens. I think I made a comment on that. And just a few days later on social media, I came across this story someone shared, and they're from Malaysia. So they shared the story and they commented that this is a story that is very similar to the Swan Maiden story from the European tradition. And I was like, okay, that's a sign, right? Because that's what I was thinking about and ruminating over it. So I asked them for the full story because they'd only given me a snapshot, and I asked them for this full story, and they shared it with me. And yeah, so it's lovely. I mean,
for everyone watching, this also is some kind of indication of the nerd circles that Gary is on social media.
Yeah. So it's like, you think of something and the same thing comes up just randomly, and it was nice because on a superficial reading, I mean, I wouldn't have guessed that this is similar to the Swan Maiden. So it was lovely to have that hint and the kind of prod to show me in the right direction. And of course, I brought it to you, and we kind of brainstormed over that. So, but I'm also excited because the first time I've picked up from Southeast Asian tradition.
Right.
So it's a Malaysian folk tale. So yeah.
Fantastic. Okay, well that's great. I'm excited. Will you tell us the story?
Yeah. So the story is in general folk tale in Malaysia, in the Malayan tradition, is that this is a story about the origin of a tree and a flower, which they call Bunga Tanjung. And Bunga is flower in Bahasa, and Tanjung is cape. So it's the flower of the cape. And the story kind of sets out how the flower was brought to the earth, right? So that's a premise. And the story goes about how once upon a time, deep inside a beautiful forest, which was, kind of cut away from all humans, there was this beautiful pool, which was lit every full moon with a milky white light, and there was a waterfall nearby which fed the pool. So the water was absolutely crystal clear, looked lovely on moonlit nights. And so every full moon, fairy princesses would descend from the celestial realm to bathe in this pool and kind of, soak the beauty of the forest at the time, because apparently it was more beautiful than any place in their own celestial kingdom. And so one night, 7 fairy princesses had come down to this pool, and they kept aside their clothes and their magic scarves, and they went into the pool to bathe. And after they bathed, they came back on, they put on their clothes, and that's when the youngest princess realized that she couldn't find her magic scarf. And she looked everywhere, but she couldn't find it. And the thing was that she couldn't return to her home, to her celestial home, without the magic scarf. And the other princesses who helped her around to find the scarf, and they couldn't find it either. Now, if they stayed back beyond sunrise, they would also be stuck and couldn't go back home. So as the time came, as close to dawn, they felt very sad, but they had no choice but to leave the youngest princess and go back home. Right. So when sunrise approached, the 6 princesses said, "We're really sorry, but we have to go back." And the youngest princess was left behind. And even after they left, she looked desperately everywhere, and she just could not find that scarf. And finally, she gave up and sat under a tree and started to cry. Because, she was lonely, she was miserable, she was afraid. She didn't know anyone or anything around here. So she was just stuck, and she didn't know for how long. And at this time, just like every day at dawn, there was an old woman who lived on the edge of the forest, who'd come into the forest to gather firewood. And today, instead of, bird calls, she heard someone weeping. And she went and she followed the sound and saw this young woman, and she had all these fine clothes on, and she was beautiful and elegant. So she assumed that she must be a princess who'd come away from the palace and lost her way in the forest. So she spoke to her and she said, "Are you lost, my child?" And the princess told her that she was from a land far, far away, and she'd lost her scarf, and without the scarf, she could not return to her land. So this old woman, in the Malaysian tradition in Malay, these old women who live on the edge of the forests, are called nenek kabayan. So nenek is literally grandmother, right? So that's how they address them. So nenek kabayan looked at her. She didn't understand anything she said, because what is this thing about scarf and going back and being stuck? But then she said, you can't stay here all by yourself. So you should come back to my hut, and we'll find a way to get you back to your house. So the princess followed her back to her hut, and she showed her around. She fell asleep right away because she was so exhausted with crying, and she was just relieved to find a shelter, right? And she fell asleep, and by the time she woke up, it was already late at night, and the old woman had gone through her day, come back home, and she'd gone fast asleep herself. So the princess woke up. She went out of the hut, and she walked back into the forest. She went and bathed in the pool, and she looked for her scarf again. And when she didn't find it, she sat down under a tree and wept again. And she wondered, why no one had come to her for help. She thought her sisters had forgotten about her. Everyone back home had forgotten about her. No one had tried to help, and she felt abandoned. She felt miserable. So she sat down and cried. And a little while later, she got back up and returned to the hut. And so the next morning, when the old woman went out to collect firewood, as usual, this time she had this magical, powerful scent. And she went to look for the source of that scent. She found these, beautiful pale yellow flowers on the ground where the princess had been sitting. And she didn't know the princess was there. So she kind of looked at them. She found them so beautiful and enchanting. She collected all of them, forgot all about the firewood. She ran back to the hut and showed them to the princess. She said, "Look, there's such beautiful flowers. I've never seen them before. And I'm sure I can sell them for good money in the market." And, the princess was still sad about not being able to go home, but, she was glad to help this kind old woman who had given her shelter. So she told her that she would make some garlands out of those flowers for her. So with her, delicate and lovely fingers, she made garlands out of the flowers. She gave them to the old woman, and she sold them in the market to, wives and daughters of rich men. And the old was so sort of attracted to the scent of the flowers and the beauty of the flowers. They were happy to pay good money. So Nenek Kabayan, then with all that money bought supplies and food and, for the princess. And these were things that she could never before, afford to buy, because she made a living out of selling firewood every day, right? And then, days went by. This would happen every night. The princess would go out at night, weep under a tree, come back home. And then Nenek would then go out into the forest, collect the flowers, sell them in the market. And all this while, Nenek Kabayan kind of wondered about, who the princess was and what her name was. But she hesitated to ask her because she thought, well, the princess might want to keep it private and not reveal it. So she didn't want to push her. And then one day, as she kind of made money out of selling the flowers, she bought a new sarong for herself. And then she bought a new sarong for the princess as well. She thought she would like new clothes. And when she went back home and gave that to her, the princess all these days had been collecting wilted and dried flowers, put them out to dry, and then soaked them in oil so that, she could make scented oil out of it. And she gave them to the old woman and said, this is how you can even work with the dried flowers, the withered flowers. And the old woman loved it because, she herself knew something about herbs and how to deal in the herb law. And she thought this was an excellent idea, right, to make scented oil and perfume out of the flowers. And then, she would go and sell them in the market too. So she started to make more money than she had ever been able to make before. And then after a few days, Nenek started to kind of suspect that these flowers had something to do with the princess because, her finding these flowers coincided with the time that the princess arrived, and she'd never seen them before. So one night, she stayed awake thinking about it, and then she saw the princess slip out of the hut. And she quietly followed her to see where she went. And then she saw the princess look for the scarf everywhere and then sit down under the tree and cry. And the old woman's heart really went out to her. She felt so sorry for her. And she wanted to go and comfort her, but, sort of held back. And she waited until the princess went back into the hut. And in the morning, she very gently asked the princess, "Do you know what these flowers are called? Where you come from? Because I've never seen these flowers before." And so the princess told her that, back home, we call these flowers Tanjung. And then she told her how, she lost this magic scarf, without which she can't go home and she needs to find it. And Nenek said, "You know what? Let's go and look for that scarf of yours tonight, right? And I'll help you. And you must really be a fairy princess from a celestial realm because, how else would you have brought so much good fortune to a poor old woman like me? So I'd like to help you. And the princess said that she was grateful as well to the old woman for helping her and taking good care of her. And so that night, the old woman and the princess went out looking for the scarf together. And it happened to be a full moon night. It had been a full month since the princess arrived. And so Nanek took the princess into the forest. They looked for the scarf. And suddenly, on a branch, in a tree branch, there was this light glow. And as they came close to it, they realized it was the scarf. Right? And the princess was delighted. She could finally go back home. And she turned to the old woman and she asked her permission to leave. And Nanek had grown so fond of her that she had tears in her eyes as she said goodbye. And the fairy princess thanked her for her kindness and said, I see how sad you are, and I'm sad as well to leave you. So I will return every full moon night to see you. And I'll make sure I'll bring the Tanjung flowers with me every time I come to see you so that you're never in want again. And so the princess kept her word, and she came to meet Nenekabayan every full moon. And every time she had to leave, she would shed tears of sadness because she was leaving Nenek. And those tears would then turn into these hundreds of Tanjung flowers. So that's the story. Artie, would you like to come back on and share your thoughts? Hi.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Wonderful. Thank you for that story.
Thank you.
I liked it even better the second time around. Thank you.
Yeah.
So let me start with my usual question, which is, where do you enter into that story? Where does that story really take you?
Yeah, so like I said, we've been talking about this whole traversing of three realms, right? In the story, The Boy Who Met Fear at Last, we talked about how the boy hesitated and kind of refused to traverse realms and how important it was, the three realms of being. And then even in the Demeter and Persephone story, we touched upon, traveling between two realms, up and down, going back and forth between the earth and the chthonic. And when I read the story, the first thing that came to me was this act of this fairy princess coming down from the celestial realm and actually finding some kind of a me time, as we call it, in the earth realm, and then going back, and this being a cycle, but this time she gets stuck. So there's something around the time she spends in the other realm, which is not her home realm. So that is what came to me. So I thought this must be something about traversing realms and what happens, the dynamics of it, the physics of it. So I was curious to kind of find out about that.
I love that. So one thing I should probably, just touch on again for those of you who have missed or haven't seen the previous sessions, when we talk about these three realms, symbolically, right? In multiple cultural mythic traditions around the world, there's this pattern, there's this archetype of the whole universe as being made up of three, in some systems, four realms. And there's a regular realm, so our regular everyday realm. There's an upper realm, right, which is like the spirit realm. And then there's the underground realm, the underworld realm of the chthonic. The chthonic just means of the night, of the underground. And the classic symbol of this is the tree, right? So the tree in the Garden of Eden, the world tree of like Norse mythology. And this tree is basically the bridge across three realms, because the tree has leaves, a tree has roots, and a tree has a trunk. And so, humans in some of these systems are seen as a kind of race of trees, like tree men. Like in the Greek system, we are the ash men, right? The ash tree. So we are able to cross all three realms, just as a course of, a natural course of our being, right? A tree naturally is in all three realms. And so in the session where we talked about the three realms of being, we talked all about the physics of that. And here what's interesting is, here we have in this fairy tale a kind of zoom in look at the detail of the physics of this traversing of realms, right? So the way I read this is that when you cross between realms, when the fairy princesses come down, when they stay for a while, when they leave, there is a kind of grief that happens, right? And this is symbolized by the tears. But in general, when you think about the crossing between realms, any kind of threshold crossing, boundary crossing, grief will be associated with that crossing. So again, these are not physical realms, these are realms of being, right? And so when you, for instance, traverse realms from one stage of life to the next, there will be grief. So for instance, when you cross over from being a child into being adult, through a formal initiation ceremony, or just through, the school of hard knocks, right? At some point, hopefully you are no longer a boy man or a girl woman. You are a full, man or woman, or adult. There will be a kind of grief because you are no longer a child, right? When you cross the threshold from adulthood into old age, there are other powers that rise in that third age of life, but you'll lose physical power, you'll lose speed, you'll lose perhaps standing in the world, right? So there will be grief at the loss of that. And then, of course, beyond that, when you die and you pass over, there is obviously grief. But even when you circle back and come back again, right, there is grief, right? When a newborn baby is born, the first thing it does is cry, right? It's like, what the hell am I doing here? No, there must be some mistake, right? Go back. So there is grief. And so when you cross, pass across realms from the regular mode into the chthonic, right, into the underworld, into the dream world when you sleep, right? As you're going down into the sleep world, you don't want to sleep. You're trying to stay up. You're looking at your phone. You want to stay awake. And then you cross over. You fall asleep. You have these incredible dreams that bring tears to your eyes. And then when you come back up, you have grief that you woke up because you didn't want to come back up. You wanted to stay down in the dream world. In the story we did a few weeks ago on Demeter and Persephone, when Persephone goes down into the underworld, of course, there was enormous grief. The entire world, right, was laid to waste with Demeter's grief as she went through that grief phase. And then, interestingly, when Persephone traversed realms again and came back up, she didn't necessarily want to come up, right? And in that reading of the story, she ate the pomegranate seeds to be able to remember her time in the underworld and to be able to go back down. Right. So, and as we said in the session on the three realms 2 weeks ago, it is this going up and down that is the generative thing, right? When the boy who didn't have fear in that Turkish tale, kept everything in its place, kept the underworld and the underworld, kept the above world, the spirit world and the spirit world, and had these very strong boundaries between realms. It ended up being a disaster for him, right? It didn't work out. He ended up finding fear, and fear in that story is what you get when you are trapped and you don't allow yourself to cross into the spirit realm or the underground realm. Okay, it is the movement of the up and down across realms that is the generative thing. You can think of it almost like the bellows action, right? The lung breathing in and out that manifests the whole world and all of reality and life experience with fertility and richness, right? And so in this story with the crone, right, and she is a crone, she is explicitly a shamanic sort of crone living in the forest The forest, of course, classically in fairy tales is a symbol of the unexplored regions of the inner world, inner self. And there is a kind of superpower that the crone has in being able to see the beings of the other realm who have come here to visit, right? And, I mean, just in some of the small details of like why the fairy princesses even came here, right? You naturally would think, well, we're just a bunch of schlubby sort of mere mortals, right? We're just a bunch of poor slobs, and everything in the spirit realm is love and light and is better than the world down here. Well, not exactly true. On the full moon, when the moon is shining on the special lake in the middle of nowhere in the deep, dark forest, it said specifically in the story that this place was even more beautiful than anything in the fairy realm, right? And of course, the moon shining down is from the upper realm. So there are certain sort of combinations when certain aspects of the two realms join together, and in the chthonic and the regular realm as well. When they have congress and intersection and interaction and engagement, a kind of beauty and power comes through that is not achievable by any single realm on its own, right? This crossing of the full moon and the lake between the realms is more beautiful, certainly than anything in this realm, but even more beautiful than anything in the spirit realm, okay? And so this crone then is a kind of shaman, right? A shaman then is a facilitator, right, of the passage between realms, a kind of midwife almost for the passage of beings, parts of us in between the realms. So the superpower here is in her ability to have liaison with the spirit world, with the fairy world. And this is symbolized in a number of ways. So she sees the princess, other people can't even see her. She knows instinctively to give her shelter. And essentially, if you think about it, she is holding sacred space for this spirit part of her. I mean, the way we read mythopoetics, dreams, fairy tales, even happenings in waking life in the everyday world, is we try to read them. When we read something mythopoetically, we're reading it in the following way, where you regard every major actor in the story or narrative to be symbolic of a different part of your own inner self. So the fairy princess is a part of you, part of your inner feminine. The crone is certainly a part of you, a part of your inner feminine. And these two parts of your inner feminine are interacting here. And as the story goes, in very harmonious good faith in both directions, right? No one's screwing the other, no one's cheating the other or holding them hostage or anything. So the crone knows to hold sacred space over the course of a month for this fairy princess, holding space for her grief, right? She cannot find the scarf. And it turns out they can only find the scarf together, right? The passage back is only after you have completed the generativity and engagement with the realm here, right? Through the interaction with the crone. And so she grieves that she cannot cross back, right? This midwife shaman comes back, helps her. But it's interesting in that it is her tears, i.e. her grieving, that is the thing that brings forth the flowers. So the grief is literally, I mean, it doesn't get any more sort of obvious and hitting us over the head than this. The grief is the thing that brings the flowers. The grief is the thing that is generative and fertile and bestowing of blessing and superpower. Okay. The grief is the thing. Because literally the tears fall to the ground of this realm and become flowers. Now they become yellow flowers. Yellow now is evocative of gold. It's the color of gold. And gold is a symbol of insight in our mythopoetic reading of fairy tales and dreams. So when you see currency, when you see money, it's more a symbol of ego power, right? So with money, with my credit card, I can swipe my credit card and have someone paint my kitchen, right, sight unseen, or a car will come up and deliver stuff to me or take me to the airport or whatever. So money is a symbol of ego power, but gold is beyond money. It is a symbol of insight, right? right? The raw gold in the earth that you need to go down into the chthonic and mine and bring back up. Okay. Flowers then, because these are golden yellow flowers. Flowers themselves are a symbol of typically the full integration of inner masculine and inner feminine. And one of the reasons for this is that flowers have both masculine sex organs and feminine sex organs, right? In your grade school, grammar school, biology class, you learn that, what are the names? Every flower has like a stamen and a pistil, and each flower has both organs inherent to themselves, right? So a flower is a symbol of the masculine and the feminine, elegantly and harmoniously integrated, complete in and of itself. It can obviously self-pollinate and keep going, right? And so the princess's tears of grief literally bring golden flowers, insight and integration. This is what happens when you cross the realms. You have vision. The crone has vision to be able to see the princess, and this vision takes you into an engagement with the spirit realm. So you have a vision, it takes you to the spirit realm. You have a dream, you have a fantasy during the day of what could be, right? You come back from the spirit realm, and you know what to do, right? Steve Jobs of Apple has been trying to like create his, iPhone since like the 90s, and this vision just kept hitting him until he finally circumambulated enough so that the iPhone, finally came out, right? The Eiffel Tower, the Golden Gate Bridge, every major thing has started in a fantasy in somebody's head, in somebody's mind. And all of these things start from the spirit realm and come down to us, right? So traversing up to the spirit realm is generative and fruitful in that way. But also, going down into the underrealm is generative and fruitful. You have a tragedy, you have an unfortunate event, a loss of a job, a loss of a relationship. If you allow yourself to go down, you go down into the underground, into grief, right? You don't stay up here drinking and numbing everything away, trying to run away from it. As I often say, the difference between grief and depression is that in grief, you willingly go down, right? Where you just sit with the pain of the loss. And with depression, you're numbing, you're drinking, you're pushing it back, you're running away. And then eventually a hand comes up, grabs you, and pulls you down anyway, right? You end up getting to the same place. But, the style points are different in either case, right? So then the full winter comes, and you spend winter down in the underground, right? You're like this dormant seed, and in the winter, right, all the trees are bare. It feels like everything has died. Nothing will ever be okay again. And then eventually, it turns out everything does come back, and everything does blossom and bloom again. Crossing the three realms, the pain of it, the fear of it, the resistance of it, right? And then finally going, or the grief of being stuck in one realm when you want to be in another, right? All of this sort of resistance, circumambulation, struggle, drama, the pain, the fear, all of this is fruitful and generative. And you're like, well, why does it have to be so hard? Why can't we just like drink ambrosial nectar like the gods, right? And in the classical Greek sense, it's like this is our lot as mortals, right? There's all kinds of sort of stories and mythopoetics around how we got to this state of affairs. And you can call it wretched, or you could call it sublime and a blessing, because unlike the gods, we die, right? So things taste better to us because we know they will pass. So anyway, so there's one round of this. Grief, tears, flowers pop up from the tears, and you get garlands. These things that ring yourself on the head like a halo, or around your neck, protecting and enhancing the power of your voice. And the people of the regular realm, the profane realm, pay top dollar in ego power to even get a whiff of this, right? because only through the shaman can you get this. Only through the shaman can you get this. Because regular people can't, they don't know where to get the flowers, they don't see the princess, they're just sort of stuck in this realm. So the shaman is like a merchant who can cross realms on your behalf to bring you these fruits of the spirit realm. In the Greek system, the ultimate shamanic figure is Hermes. And we call him the messenger god who like crosses realms. He's the one that actually goes down into the underworld in the Persephone Demeter story, assisted by Hecate, just to make sure we give her that honor and recognition as well. To basically sweet talk Hades, out of letting Persephone back up, right? And this is why Hermes is then the god of messengers and boundary crossing, right? So thieves and messengers cross boundaries. So he's the meta god of boundary crossing, and tricksters, because to cross boundaries when you're not allowed, you need to pick locks and make it into the other realm. And then also merchants and travel and exchange and trade, because you trade across boundaries. Arbitrage is across boundaries. And the very name merchants come from the Roman name for Hermes, right? Hermes is the Greek name, and the Roman name for Hermes, the same god, is Mercury, right? So a merchant is a mercant, right? A sort of agent of Mercury, merchants. Mercantile, mercado, supermercado, market, supermarket, all of these are named after Mercury and Hermes. So as time goes on, the fruits of this integration become even more potent, not just as garlands, but as scented oil. And the way I read that is that these insights become even more embodied, right? They're not sitting lightly on your head or around your neck above your clothing. But the essence of the flower, the essence of grief, right? And note that she doesn't take the fresh flowers and put them in oil. She takes the wilted flowers. So this is old grief, right? Grief of something you lost many, many years ago, where the flowers are still there. And what do you do with this old grief, right? Old grief becomes embodied. So the essence of the flower is infused in oil. Okay, and oil then is something that is viscous. It's not intellectual. Oil is something that you smell in a much more concentrated way, and something you put on your body. So it's embodied and it's instinctual, right? Because scent is evocative of instinct and intuition, right? When you're in a business meeting and you're like, everything looks fine, but something just doesn't smell right. Something doesn't smell right about the situation. It's very intuitive, right? And so as grief is allowed in and harvested, right, it brings you ego power, brings you insight and integration. But then over time, there's a kind of seasoning that happens where, just in real life, think about it. Things you grieved years ago in earlier parts of your life are still with you, right? If you lost a family member as a child, even now you're an adult, you're an elder, you still miss that loss, right? But the nature of it is different. It has infused into your body. It has become a part of who you are. It informs your instinct and intuition. And then, of course, the dead giveaway for this embodiment is that in round 2, the old woman gives her in exchange for this embodied scented oil, right, of embodied grief. Now, mind you, in the story, only a month has gone by, but it's mythological time. So a month could easily be like a couple decades, right? If you transpose it into real time. And the dead giveaway here is that in a parallel transformation, the crone takes some of the ego power of the flowers, the money, and transmutes them into a pair of sarongs, one for her and one for the princess. And we've said in numerous fairy tales before, with the tailors and everything, clothing is a symbol of embodiment. So now in this realm, the crone is re-embodied with this essence of grief and insight. Right? And mind you, they're both different faces of the same inner feminine within you. Right? Because we read the princess as an aspect of your inner feminine and the crone as an aspect of your inner feminine. So they both get re-embodied. And she gives this fairy of the spirit world princess an embodiment sarong for this realm as well. Okay. So round 2, you get the initial insight and integration in round 1. And in round 2, it sinks into your body, grief sinks into your body, becomes a part of who you are, contributes to a re-embodiment of who you are and just how you even feel. Your felt sense of yourself changes with grief, and informs your sense of instinct and intuition. Okay. So long story short, grief, do I even need to say it, is essential. Grief is essential. It's painful, it's terrifying, and it's essential. So at this point of the story, so far, it's gorgeous all around. And then the princess leaves. Okay. Notably, it's only after they're both embodied and after they have full communication of what the heck is actually going on here, that then they go out together on the next full moon. And then with the dual inner feminine powers fully engaged, fully re-embodied with insight, integration, and intuition, they go out in good faith. That's when you find the scarf. That's when you find the scarf. Right? I mean, the number one rule of like dealing with the fairy world or the underworld is that you can make deals, but you need to deal in good faith. Right? And we note here beautifully that the crone deals with the princess in good faith. Not like in Hansel and Gretel, where the witch lures them and tries to trap them. The crone here holds sacred space for her grief without even a deal. She just is the midwife. She is the shaman. So she knows what to do. And then she deals with her in good faith. And with their combined power, they find the magic scarf. Interestingly, the princess asks for the old woman's permission to leave. Like, why does she ask permission? And it's this recognition that we are bound now, right? It's like Persephone and Hades. They are bound now. So there is this sort of checking in. When we do healing, right? And we have this sort of crux moment in the healing process of what we call in healing, in our healing system, interviewing the lost board member. And those of you who've done healing, a lot of you will know what I'm talking about. Often, we'll be like, okay, one and done. I did my interview and now I'm done. And then, weeks or even months later, the advisee will come back and they'll be like, yo, I'm stuck again. I don't know what's going on. And my usual question, right, because I've been doing this for a while for a lot of people, is, well, have you checked in with your lost board member lately? And they look at me like a deer in the headlights. I'm like, well, what do you mean? And it's like, you did the first interview. Yeah, I did that like 6 months ago. Like, but you've checked in with the lost board member, since then, right? And they're like, oh, oh, okay. It's like, yeah, just check in. Well, don't I already know what they said? It's like, it's an act of good faith, right? To check in anyway. Right? It's like when you're at work and you're working for a good boss or whatever, or a client. Even if you check in extra with your client, and they're like, no, you got it. That's exactly right. Right? What will they say? They'll say, yeah, no, you got it. So there's no new information to be exchanged, but I appreciate that you checked in. Right? So the princess doesn't need to ask for the old woman's permission, but she checks in anyway. And the crone, on her part, acting in good faith, says, yes, absolutely. You can go. And as she sits there with it, tears come up from her body as well. So she cries tears of grief, right? And then what fruits from her tears of grief are not flowers from the ground. What she gets is the source of the flowers herself. The princess regards her in her grief. And then she says, well, don't worry, I miss you too. I'll just come back then. Right? Absolutely beautiful. I mean, this, when I read this and we were brainstorming together on it, it made me wonder, even in the Persephone story, right, where she ate the pomegranate seeds to stay connected to the underworld and Hades. It made me wonder if the pomegranate seeds in the Persephone story were the tears of Hades himself, right? Where he's like, my love, you're going to leave. And he starts crying these pomegranate seeds. And she replies, no, no, my dear, it's fine. I will eat these tears and I will come back. And the main thing about all this, obviously, is that these interactions, these engagements, these setting, these establishments of the regular rhythms with Persephone and Hades, of the seasons of the year, and in this story of the flowers coming up every full moon, are all engaged and established with no fear, threat, or control. These patterns of the world are established in the sacred, not in the profane, because they are established with no fear, threat, and control. Deeply, deeply beautiful. So, I mean, at a profane level, you would say, this is just some old wives' tale that gives the origin story of these flowers. Just these primitive tribes in Malaysia making up these cute little stories about the flowers. We actually know where the flowers came from. Here's the evolutionary sort of evidence and everything. So you could brush that off and say that at the profane level, it's just the origin story of flowers. But it's actually much more complex and archetypal than that, right? Where the message, the sort of not allegorical message, but the symbol, right, that we see in multiple sort of world traditions that just arises out of our biology spontaneously across multiple cultures, multiple civilizations. The symbol here that comes up is that this kind of instinct and embodiment of flowers, of oil symbolically, comes from the harmonious traversing of realms, even despite grief and tears and pain. Right? The fruit of the grief is the tears. It is the flowers. I'm not really, let me try to say this another way. It is that grief is something we fear. Grief is a threat. It's like, if this happens, you're going to go into deep grief, and then what? So you control your life to avoid grief at all costs. So in the profane world, we associate grief with fear, threat, or control, right? But the point here of a story like this is that you can go into grief and tears and pain without fear, threat, or control. You can go into grief while you are in the sacred. And in fact, that is the more powerful, the actual effective way of going into grief. Because it's in the sacred where, when you have these tears of grief, it is in the sacred that they turn into flowers, because the shaman crone was holding sacred space for her and protecting her and feeding her and doing all of that. She wasn't holding her hostage, right? So another way of reading that is that the fruit of the grief is the tears, it is the flowers, when these tears of grief are shed in the sacred. So what does it mean when you have grief in the sacred, not the profane? Well, in the profane, we know, is simply by definition the realm of fear, threat, or control. So you're grieving and you're like, okay, when am I going to get over this? I have to move on. I have to control. I have to get a hold of myself, get on with my life. That's fear, threat, or control. All right, take a pill, watch movies, date the next person to sort of like just fly over all of that. Okay. Grief in the sacred, and that's not even grief. It's just avoiding grief. Grief in the sacred is to sit with the pain. And without fear, threat, or control, what does that mean? That means, when you grieve something without fear, threat, or control, you're saying, it's okay that this happened. And it's okay, or rather, I hold space for the fact that this happened. And I hold space for the fact that I am distraught and like at my wit's end that this happened. and I hold space for this pain that feels like it will never, ever, ever go away. And you hold space for that. That's it. That's the role of the shaman midwife. And then something births out. That's not why you do it, right? The shaman didn't do this to get the flower. She just did it for no good reason, because she's in the sacred. Right? So you don't go into grief in order to have a better healing process. That's control. Right? You hold space for the grief when it comes for no good reason. People are like, well, how do you grieve? What are the process steps? And it's like, it's hard to answer that question, because that the very tenor of that question is soaked in control. And so when you hold space for the pain of grief for no good reason, stuff will start to gestate and birth, but that's not why you do it. Right? As far as you know, in the middle of your grief, this will never end. And you're like, whatever, so be it. I'm not leaving. I'm not leaving. Where am I going to go anyway? Right? Where am I going to go? So spread out over the course of a life at the sort of zoom out 30,000 foot level, it then expands and scales up to this level of understanding, or not understanding, but just feeling at the instinct level, at the smell level, where you smell it and it's like, okay, it actually smells okay. Where, for instance, it's okay to be born and to cry. It's okay to move through the phases of your life and have grief. It's okay to die and to cry. And this is a natural part of it. Grief is a critical component of this transition between realms. Without grief, there can be no full transition. These transitions are incomplete. Your life will feel stunted. And if you're okay, there's no threat. If you're okay with that, I mean, most of us have unprocessed grief, right? And, you know, we're doing okay. You know, we could always do better, but we're doing okay. We're sitting around, we're listening to Sacred Space on Sunday. We're not complete dunderheads. You know, we're doing okay. Right? So you can have these sort of imperfect processes, and the river of life continues rolling on, right? So even in talking about grief, there is no fear, threat, or control that says, you better digest all of your grief or else, no gold star for you. There's none of that. We're just describing the state of affairs that is so. And many of you, you know, myself included perhaps, may be like, yeah, okay, I'm okay with still being the imperfect mythopoetic person and running, screaming, terrified of these last remnants of grief that I may be feeling. That's human too, right? That's human too. That's kind of the drama and glory of being human, where even if when you know the right thing to do, or what seems like the right thing to do, you still don't do it. And, you know, that's, we get to do that. We get to do that. We get to do that in exchange for the other things we've perhaps given up, right, to be human. Okay, so those are my main notes. And I think, Gary, if you want to come back up, you had, as my editor, Gary got downloads from her muse on like one way she would like to engage and connect this with some other stories that we've done as well. Hi.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah, I mean, you touched on the thing that I wanted to ask you about is how we want to kind of avoid fully going into grief if we can help it, because, you know, it's scary to sit with grief for a long time. And I wonder if in the story that we did, the Turkish folktale of the boy who met fear at last, and I'll leave the link in a short while. And in that story, I think that was the main theme, where the boy has 3 chances and 3 different occasions. He comes this close to traversing from one realm to another. And almost at the last minute, he kind of backs off and says, no, that's not for me. I'm not going to do it. And in all those three different instances, he almost goes to the edge and then he backs off. It makes me wonder if this is what it was, that instinctive kind of feeling that you want to avoid grief, and you know that if you traverse those realms, there will be grief accompanying with that. So, you don't want to deal with it. It's natural, like you said, to not want to deal with grief. But I wonder if that's the flavor that the story was. It didn't say it explicitly, but if that's what was happening there.
Yeah, one of the differences between this story and the Boy Who Met Fear at Last, the traversing three realms story. So as I make these comments, I just want to remind everyone that when we say masculine and feminine, we're not talking about gender. We're talking about the principles within you, right? So everyone, regardless of their gender, has what we call masculine and feminine. So when I say masculine, feminine, you can think of it as saying eyes and ears, right? So I'm not saying men are a certain way or women are a certain way. All men have masculine and feminine in them, and all women have masculine and feminine in them. But when you see a difference in stories, right? So in The Boy Who Found Fear at Last, he didn't have a good outcome, right? And he avoided traversing realms. And in this story, it was almost a perfect, beautiful sort of outcome. What you try to do, especially when dreams come up like this, you try to look at the key differences between scenario A and scenario B. Okay. And the key difference in the scenarios between these two myths is that in The Boy Who Met Fear at Last, there was no powerful feminine influence. Right, he was a boy. He was like working with thieves and robbers and all this other stuff. The mother kind of shows up in the beginning, but then he just keeps rolling, right?
Right.
Whereas here, there's practically no masculine figure at all. It's like two aspects. Count them, not one but two aspects of the wisdom feminine. So it's the wise crone and the fairy princess. Right? It's like you almost can't get any more powerful than that. And so they have instinct and vision that just crank forward. And the boy has, the masculine sort of power of rolling forward, but he lacks vision. And so this is the kind of thing when you lack vision, and he does what you do when you lack vision. You hew to norms, you keep things as they are. That's over there, this is over there, we just keep it that way. It is literally, and this is not a criticism, it is literally what a conservative mentality is. When we call someone conservative, the name literally means someone who believes in conserving, someone who believes in keeping the status quo as it is. I'm conservative, I'm traditional, I like things just the way they are. I don't want innovation, I don't want new lifestyles, I don't want all this fancy thinking, because it's untested, you're just pulling it out of thin air. Whereas the traditions we've had for hundreds of years, in some cases thousands of years. So if it ain't broke, don't fix it. So it's this very linear mentality, only what I could see with my two eyes. No imagination, no creativity. And I'll just say, even in the US, right? Technology, innovation, biotech, financial innovation tend to happen in the more politically liberal areas. California, the two coasts. And I'm not saying that's a good thing. I mean, financial innovation, technological innovation, you could say for better or worse. It's not, a given that it's all good. But these kinds of things that we refer to even in industry as visionary, right, tend to happen in the less conservative areas. And that's, and the less conservative areas are also in some ways more feminine, right? More feminine and less patriarchal. Not completely. The overlay is still, unfortunately, patriarchal, but it has that more sort of open feeling.
Right.
Yeah. So that's kind of one way I think about that.
Yeah, and the other thing that came to me, by the way, there's a question that I thought I'll quickly answer. Is there a link for the story that you shared today? Well, unfortunately, the story was told to me by someone on social media, and they kind of shared it with me in private, and they said that they've heard this story being told in parts of Malaysia. So, it's kind of, I don't have a link for the original text, unfortunately. So I think that what I narrated in video form is what there is. Well, the
Gowrie is your Fraser here. Gowrie is your source.
Right. So the other thing that I was reminded of as you shared your thoughts about this story. Actually, there are two stories that I would like to go back to. One is a story that we did way back I think it was like the third or fourth session of stories that we did. It was a Japanese folktale. And the very obvious common symbol that we had in that folktale, it was called The Old Man Who Made Withered Flowers Bloom. So there was this motif that came up in that story where his dog dies and goes through these multiple transformations. The buried body of the dog then turns into a tree, and the tree then is transformed as a pounding staff for the old man, mochi, which the old man uses, and then that gets burnt, and the ashes. Finally, the final thing is the ashes that this old man gets, and when he sprinkles those ashes over trees, it makes the withered flowers of that tree bloom back again. So we have this motif of the ashes of grief causing flowers to bloom, right? Which is very similar to kind of the motif that we see in this story. And I particularly remembered the point you had made in that story, that there's this aspect of making flowers bloom, but really not going beyond that. Right? I mean, you just have this one cherry tree that
profane sort of money and prestige from the Duke.
I mean, you go to the Duke and you make his garden bloom, but beyond that, what do you kind of see as a vision for that magical ability, right? So you called it visionless at that time. So there was no vision for this gift of manifestation, right?
Right.
And I see in this story, like you said, that there's this crone who's a shaman, who holds kind of space for this kind of grief that's happening. But also she's able to kind of extract this power of, the ego power, a life force of money out of this beautiful gift. I mean, she goes into the marketplace, she trades it for money, and she then trades it for supplies and clothes. She's able to kind of transfer
from other women, interestingly.
From other women. I mean, this story is all about the women, including the full moon in the sky. It's just so full of feminine power. It's lovely. And she's able to do this. And when I was thinking in comparison of the two stories, is it showing really the stark difference in what a shaman, what a crone with this kind of vision can do with the same gift of grief? What would you say to that?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the Shiro story is another example of the Japanese story. In that story too, one of the things we said was that the way you look at whether a fairy tale circumambulatory narrative arc pattern is something you may want for yourself or not, right, is you look at the beginning state and the end state. And in the Shiro story, in the beginning state, they were an old couple, childless couple, and what they wanted more than anything else was to have a child. Okay, and all this stuff happened, the ups, the downs, the laughter, the tears. But then at the end, if you look at the end state of the story, he's like, his rival has been like defeated. he has all this money and power and wealth, the sort of blessings of the Duke and everything, and yet they're still childless, right? Now, the story doesn't bemoan that. It doesn't say, see, they're still, you just notice, the thing right from the first sentence that they wanted, they still don't have in the end, right? There is still not this inner masculine, inner feminine integration from which the fruit of the generativity, the procreation happens. And that's why in all of these like fairy tales, it's when the princess and the prince come together, and the correct prince and the correct princess, not the false, evil stepsister or whatever, when they come together and have happily ever after to be fruitful and multiply. This is not a conservative would read it as like, well, this just proves, marriage is between a man and a woman, right? It's like, that's not the point of that. It's that it's the inner masculine in you and the inner feminine in you coming together in full integration, like in a flower, right? Complete in itself. And from that, the fruitfulness comes forth, right? Which doesn't necessarily mean biological children, but it's like your creativity, your productivity, your generativity as an artist, as whatever it is you do in your life, for your bliss, your bliss. But if it flows forward and you're in this like job that you hate because you're doing it for money and prestige, then there will be that next level of conflict, and the next fairy story that comes from that. So here, he's, and in the Shiro story, also is a very conspicuous absence of the power of the inner feminine.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, not to say I don't want to cross any lines here, but when you look at a dream and you see the conspicuous absence of a particular figure, the Hephaestian figure, the Hermetic figure, the Athenian figure, the artisanal figure, right? But just to keep it simple, inner masculine, inner feminine. When you look at a religion and they say God the Father, the natural question that you actually get punished if you ask, but the natural logical question is like, God the Father, okay, that's cool. Where's the mother? Right? Where's the mother? If there's a Trinity, is there a feminine aspect of the Trinity, or is she outside the sort of, and in dreams, in fairy tales, in stories, you look for the missing element, right? So in a patriarchal society, the elder feminine with authority and power is missing. And then you look at the society and you say, well, what's wrong with the society? What are its major problems? And often you can link them right back to that missing element, right? So in our society, even in popular culture, our elder, powerful wizards, Gandalf, Dumbledore, Yoda, Morpheus, right, across the different movie universes. So quick, tell me, right, what is a female Gandalf? Who's the female Yoda? And you're like, I don't know. You can maybe come up with something. And you can say, well, it's Hecate. It's this. It's like, well, I don't see them in popular media, in the collective consciousness, right? They're there. Obviously, they're there. But they're buried. They're buried. Anyway, yeah, just threads of potential inquiry for you to follow on your own.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of which, I think if anyone would like to check out the session on the wise woman archetype that we covered.
Right, yeah.
So I could link to that as well. So I'll share the link in a while. And something that struck me, which hadn't occurred to me before, the wise woman archetype, we covered the story called The Goose Girl. And amazingly, the crone, the wise woman, the old woman who lives on the edge of the forest in that story, it comes from the European tradition. And even in that story, the girl whom she holds space for, the girl whom she shelters and protects, is a princess who's been thrown out of the palace by her father, right? So she goes into the forest and this old woman kind of adopts her, cares for her. and keeps her sheltered until the right prince comes along, and then she facilitates the union of the prince and the princess.
That's right.
So it's so kind of, it has this exact same flavor that we have in this story, where she gives space to this princess who's lost from her home, and helps her go back.
And then the classic question of like, oh, well, was there a master storyteller that like went around the world and dropped these things? And you know, our answer is typically no. You know, you don't need a bird to go around telling all the birds what a nest is, what a beak is, and what an egg is, right? These patterns, these archetypes arise out of their biology. And so for humans, which are like hugely cultural and mythopoetic animals as well, you know, I don't need to go around telling every human what an eye is or what an ear is. I don't need to go around telling every human what the inner feminine and inner masculine are, or what grief is, or what tears mean. Yeah, this is, it comes with the whole package.
Right. Right.
And what a beautiful package it is.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many of these symbols and motifs that we can kind of find in common and parallel. And I want to touch on what my friend said when he shared this story, is that it reminds him of the Swan Maidens, right? And you have the same seven sisters, celestial beings who come down into the earth, into the dark forest. You have the motif of, you know, bathing in a pool, the motif of the full moon. So all of those, and I'll share the link to that. And the main theme, though, in that story was the nature of circumambulation. That's what we discussed back then, of how it has this flavor of hide and seek, and not kind of just going round and round aimlessly, but kind of a hide and seek, a playful way, right? And how this hunter in that story traverses realms in this hide and seek way to integrate with the feminine. And none of that is like punishment. Oh, he made a mistake, or he did this thing, so he was punished. And none of that, but just this is how it works, right? And there comes a point in, almost towards the end of the story, where he has to identify his wife, you know, from the seven identical sisters. And the way he does that is that he recognizes his wife from her fingers, because they're worn out by all the needlework she's been doing while she was married to him, and she had children with him, and she was sewing clothes for them. And, you know, her fingers showed signs of that. Whereas, you know, all the other six sisters, who were these celestial kind of maidens, had impeccable fingers, right? So he could tell who his wife was from that. It was really a very tiny detail in the story, but
it was huge, yeah.
Yeah, but really huge in terms of the importance of embodiment that happens in traversing these realms. And I'm particularly struck by this detail, even in this story, where the story actually mentions nimble and elegant fingers, while garlands for the old woman.
Yes.
Right? The story actually takes the trouble of mentioning that little detail.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, this connection between vision and embodiment, and craft, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's that thing that Joe Campbell said his wife once said to him, right? I think his wife was Jean Erdman, the dancer, right? And she said, you know, I'm paraphrasing, but she said something along the lines of like, you know, the artist and the mystic, right, are the same way, right? They're like cut from the same cloth, except the mystic doesn't have a craft.
Yeah.
Right, and the artist, and of course she's a dancer, so she has a craft, and he's more of like the mystic. Those are the kinds of like conversations that happen between husband and wife at that level, right? So, so she was like, you know, the mystic doesn't have a craft, And so here it's like the ideal, right? Spoken by, the feminine counterpart of Joe Campbell herself.
Right.
Who isn't writing books, she's dancing literally in her body.
Yeah.
Is that, vision is interesting, necessary, but the way you bring that down is through embodiment, right? So even the fairy princess can make garlands, can infuse oil, right, and collect the withered blossoms. And so, vision embodied is like the ultimate, right? And in this story, it happens. The sarong is like re-embodiment in this realm. And when we talk about, grief, right, there's an aspect of grief where grief itself is completed in a way through embodiment. And we have a little bit of time, so I just want to go into this as well, because I think, especially now as we are coming out of COVID, we get a lot of questions on like, how do we grieve? Like, what is the process by which we go through that? And I can talk about what grief is, and the process of sitting with loss and pain, right, and everything we've already said. It's hard to say exactly how to do it, because that implies a level of control that you don't have when you grieve, right? When you surrender to grief, it is a surrender, and you don't know how you're going to do it. The only thing you're really doing is surrendering. So it's hard to say what are the formula steps on how to grieve. But the other thing I can give here, based on your talking about this question that's pulling this out of me, is another question you might ask then is, okay, I'm surrendering, I'm just free falling, I have no idea how far I'm going to fall or what I'm going to hit when I get to the bottom. But screw it, where am I going to go? Right? There's no escape from this grief. So I'm just going to let myself fall. And then the question then may arise, how do I know when I'm done? Right? So, all right, Artie, I'm not going to try to control it. I'm just going to go into grief. Let whatever happens, happens. But is there a sign? Is there a way to know when I'm done? And again, not to take this as a control element, but a pattern that often comes up is that when you are done with grief, so not for sure, but one sign that will show up perhaps at the end stages of grief, as you come out of grief, okay, are two things: blessing and gratitude. Blessing and gratitude are, for me, the key signal markers of when you're coming out of grief. And the classic example is, let's say you're a guy and you've just gone through this like very contentious divorce and, all this stuff, like sort of lawyers and fighting over like lamps and like furniture and custody and everything. And finally it's done. Finally it's done. The final thing is done, dusted, everything's set. And if you imagine this guy then calling together all his friends, right, who are still on his side, all of his friends together at their favorite bar watering hole, and he buys them all a round of drinks, okay? And then he says, I want to raise a glass. And the question is, at that point, what does he say, right? Does he say, good riddance to that old battle axe, I never should have married her, she's awful, blah, 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 blah. So that's one way he could go. And then the other way he could go is to say something like, well, it didn't work out, but those were some of the best years of my life. And I learned so much. And even though I couldn't keep her, she made me a better man, right? And I thank her for this. And, maybe not in so many words, I bless her and I wish her all the best going forward with whoever she ends up with her new man. He's a better man than I am. But, lucky so and so that I am. I got to be with her for the time that I did, right? And that is blessing and gratitude. Blessing and gratitude marking the true end of grief. It's important to say here that this state, when you feel that toast coming from this guy, this is not an intellectual state. Right? This is not a state of the intellect, of control, of like, well, I read this self-help book and this was step 5, so I'm going to do step 5 now, right? Blessing and gratitude are not an intellectually held concept. They are a state of the body. They are a felt sense, blessing and gratitude, and they are a state of the soul. Another way you could say it is that your state of surrender in grief, right, as you start coming out of the cocoon into your butterfly stage, if you continue in your state of surrender, you will come into blessing and gratitude, because blessing and gratitude are also states of surrender. Okay. Now, ideally, when you come into the state of blessing and gratitude, you have the presence of mind to understand it intellectually too, right? Ideally, you see it and have vision around your blessing, and then you continue to traverse realms. Part of the failure of the Shiro story is that he had this blessing but did not see it or realize it. And you know, I mean, if you pour ash around the base of a tree and you can make withered flowers bloom, and he and his wife are childless, with a little vision and maybe a fairy goddess coming to him whispering in his ear, he would have the presence of mind to take the ashes back to him and his wife and like just pour it all over the two of them. Right? But it's like, no, he's like, well, the Duke told me to go, so I went, and I'm just doing what I'm told. I'm just, you know, I'm just a simple man, just trying to get by, right? And the boy who had no fear, right, did not realize what a blessing it was to have no fear. He kept pushing and poking, but not traversing realms, and it led him to knowing fear again. So one of the keys here for me is that in the state of blessing and gratitude, with successful or complete generative and you could almost say satisfying grieving, right, and transformation, one of the things that comes is that you're comfortable in either realm. Right, so it's not just you traverse realms, dip a toe, you know, grab the magic scarf and go scurrying back. It's like you're comfortable in either realm. The princess comes back every full moon. She's like, hey, how you doing? You know, hey, Bobby, I'll have the usual, right? They all know her by name. Right? And she goes back up to the fairy world. Obviously, she's comfortable there. Persephone, after this whole thing, the establishment of winter and like, you know, the sort of the sort of barren season, she continues to go back into the underworld. Like literally, Persephone, the goddess of the underworld, winters in the underworld because it's warmer there. It's toasty and warm in hell, haha, right? And the point is, the underworld is just as much her home as this realm. And the same for the princess. And in healing, when we've done those more intense stories like Devil's Sooty Brother, right? At the end of it, he goes back down into the underworld because he still has the key to that cave, right? One of the things that happens with grief is that you realize the scary basement of your house where all these things are hidden is still your house. Right? At first you fear it, you never go down there. Then eventually you learn to claim it. Right? The basement of my house is my house too. I do not fear it. Yeah. And so with blessing and gratitude, which is the feeling that was between the crone and the princess at the end, they both had blessing and gratitude in both directions. And they felt very comfortable, the princess going back. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's really powerful to think of it in this way where, you know, when Persephone goes into the underground, and for the first time, she is really snatched down, right? And she has no idea this world even exists. She's kind of pulled down by force, and she's there.
And she's pulled down, by the way, while she's wandered away picking flowers.
picking flowers, exactly.
Right.
And she goes into this underground, and of course she's scared and desperate to meet her mother again and all of that. But as you said, she spends time there and claims it as her home. That's when it ceases to be that kind of a prison, right? And you realize even in the very loaded word, and I'm scared to use it, depression. It's that thing where you go into this basement, this underground, where you don't want to be there, and you constantly, mourn the loss of your regular realm, and you think that that's where I should be. I don't want to be here, and I'm being kept here by force. That adds to the additional kind of despair. And the moment you realize this is my home as well, this basement also belongs to me. This is my place, and I can go back up and come down, and whether I do it voluntarily, whether I do it as the seasons come and go, it doesn't matter. Wherever I am, it's my place. It makes like a huge difference in terms of not only how comfortable you feel, but also the blessing and gratitude, like you said, that comes with it. Just with that realization, it's so enormously powerful.
Yeah, I mean, just listening to you talk, it occurs to me that, like, mythopoetically, right, the antidepressant pill, or even coffee, right, is like a pomegranate seed of the above world.
Right.
When we go down, we take the antidepressant pill, and it wrenches us back up into like the world of like, feeling better and feeling normal, right? And the point is not that it's good or bad, right? The point is that there are all these mechanisms across all three realms to like get you from one to the other to the next, or to keep you in one and out of the other. And for me, there's no right answer, right? There's no right answer. It's just this, almost like this acknowledgement of like, you do have a choice, right? You do have a choice. Like, people will say, I'm tired of this. I need to take this medication so I can just feel normal, right? And that's their choice. And then after a while, they may say, I am normal feeling. I've got my brain chemistry under control, but I don't feel like myself, right? And there will be then a calculus of like, do I reduce medication? Do I go off medication? And again, this is a very personal, there is no right or wrong answer. And again, in saying these things, I'm not proposing a cure or a regimen of control, right? But I'm merely observing that like, there are many different mechanisms that we decide on in life. And they have to do with like, when do we go from one realm to the next, and how much time do we stay in one realm versus another? And of course, the natural question is, if something is trying to keep you in one realm, it's not that it's right or wrong, but the question would be like, the holding space question would be like, why is that? Why is that? Is there something that I'm being called to grieve that I'm resisting? Right. And especially in sacred space, I will say, if you're resisting grieving, that's okay. We hold space for you resisting your grieving. We're not going to tell you, kind of get over your fear and go down and grieve properly, right? I mean, frankly, even outside sacred space, I'm not going to say that to you. Because it is your sovereign choice.
Right.
Even if you say, I don't get to decide, I'm just a helpless victim of circumstance, that itself is also a choice. Right? Because you are the sovereign of your life, always. What else?
So, really powerful to kind of ruminate on. I'm guessing that thread of thoughts that we had is going to lead into our reflection exercise for the week. So would you?
Okay, yeah.
That exercise? Yeah? Okay,
sure.
Let me get into the background.
So the exercise we thought of for this week is just really simple. And the way you would do this exercise, again, the fourth principle of proceeding sacred space, no expectation of participation. You don't have to do this. There will be no quiz. You don't need to send in your answers or anything like that. But, just to pair with this story and this discussion, only if you want. And the way you would do this exercise is this week, between now and the next session, anytime really. Just carve out, 10, 15 minutes of time alone, either in a room in your home, or if your home has a lot of people, running around, in your car, right? When you drive to get the groceries and you park before you go into the store, just sit in your car for an extra 10 minutes, take out some pen and paper, and reflect on this question. It's just 10 minutes, no one will miss you, right? And then afterwards you read it so that you have it in print outside of you all on one page at least once, and then burn it, just like throw it out, so that nobody finds it. It's not for sharing, it's only for you, and to help you get a bit of reference point triangulation, clarity for your own mind and heart and spirit. Okay. And so the exercise you would do, only if you want, is to sit quietly and think of a time when you went through a major life transition. Okay. And to think to yourself, what, if anything, was worthy of grief in that transition? Ending of a relationship, switching of careers, going from one phase of life to the next, moving to a new place, the loss of friends and community, the gaining of new ones. In a major life transition that just comes to your mind spontaneously as you think about that, to then take that transition, that time in your life, hold space for it, kind of turn it over in your hand, and say, what about this was worthy of grief? Okay. And then the natural next question is, did I grieve that fully? Fully. And again, you can use the signal markers as a bit of a, not a full litmus test, but a bit of an indication. So one way you can ask the question is, did I grieve that fully? Said another way, did I come out of that phase of my life, even now looking back, with a feeling in my body of blessing and gratitude? And for most people, even thinking about coming out of a phase like that with blessing and gratitude is just inconceivable. It may be offensive to you to even think of that. And forgive me, I don't mean to offend. I'm just putting the different puzzle pieces together. I don't know what the full scenario is, right? But just as a brainstorm, as a way of just playing with the Lego blocks, right? Regardless of blessing and gratitude, the question is, did I grieve that fully? And if the answer is no, again, that's okay, right? Most grief is incomplete, and that's okay. We carry on anyway. But if you feel like at some level, maybe you don't even have the words for it, you feel like, yeah, I'm not sure I grieved fully. The answer is not to plunge into control and say, well, I have to grieve it now. I mean, that's up to you, right? But the follow-on third question then is, so if you feel like perhaps you did not grieve fully, then another question would be, and I don't know the answer to this, did you feel that life transition was complete, was generative, was satisfying? So in the absence of grieving fully, did you feel that life transition kind of completed in a generative, fruitful, satisfying way? And the answer may be yes, maybe no. And the point here is we're just asking questions around some of the physics that we've laid out in this talk, right? So it's not an accusation. It's not a, well, you need to follow this formula and do it. It's none of that, right? It is simply a question for reflection, for generative reflection. And you would do this on your own in a state of sacred space where you're just holding space for whatever comes up, right? You're not grabbing it and running forward. It's not about control. And obviously, if all of this sounds way too intense for you to do now in the sort of, as pandemic is opening up a little bit more for people, and you just want to travel and blow off some steam, that's totally okay too. That's totally okay too. That's totally okay too. But after this talk on grief, especially at our point in this historical moment, we thought it was interesting to sort of talk about this. And so that is the accompanying exercise for you to consider, only if you want, only if you feel like it. Okay. All right. So that's it for our session. Now I'll go ahead and close the session. Our next Sacred Space session is next Sunday, same time, same place. I'll drop a link here in the chat on Crowdcast and where are we? In Facebook. Free, open to the public. Go ahead and join, sign up if you want. Feel free to invite your friends, but only if you want. And with that, I'll go ahead and close the session. So I hereby close this session of our shared sacred space. Thank you for holding this space with me and with us, and thank you for sharing the nourishment, the emotional nourishment, and the spiritual nourishment of this shared sacred space with us. I give you my blessing. Go in peace, bestowed with blessing, free of fear, free of threat, and free of the undue control of others. Have a great day, have a great week, and I will see you all in the next session. Happy Sunday, everyone. Thank you.